core practical number 3 is called the preparation of copper sulphate. Now, copper sulphate are blue crystals and they look like that, and you're going to make copper sulphate by reacting copper oxide with sulphuric acid. Now, copper oxide is a black powder, and because it's an oxide, it's a base. All oxides and hydroxides are base, and it's an insoluble base, so the black powder is insoluble in water. Now, that base reacts with an acid according to the general equation Basho. Base plus acid gives salt plus water. So copper oxide reacts with sulphuric acid to give copper sulphate and water. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the method, and we're going to look at the chemistry that's involved in that reaction as well. So if we look at the method, some of the equipment that you're going to use, your copper oxide powder and your sulphuric acid. You're going to warm your acid up in a water bath, and you're going to add your copper oxide to the acid to neutralise it. Now, once all of the acid has been neutralised, you'll end up with excess copper oxide, the black powder that's insoluble, and you need to filter off your copper sulphate solution, your blue solution, from your excess black powder. So that technique, filtration, and then you need to evaporate your blue solution, your copper sulphate solution, so that you get your copper sulphate crystals. Now that method is outlined here. You're going to first of all add excess copper oxide to sulphuric acid and warm the sulphuric acid in a hot water bath. You're then going to step 3. You're going to filter off any unreacted copper oxide to get your blue solution, and you're going to evaporate the water from your blue copper sulphate solution to leave you with crystals of copper sulphate. So breaking that down, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to measure out your sulphuric acid solution. You need 50 centimeters cubed of it. You're going to warm it on a water bath, and you're going to add your black powder to it and stir it in so that you get your blue solution. Now, you will get your blue copper sulphate, but you won't necessarily be able to see that it's blue immediately because of your black powder. Now, the black powder will react. The first spoonful will react, but the second spoonful will probably mean that your powder is in excess, and you want to add enough copper oxide so that you get rid of all of the acid and you end up with an excess of black powder. So once you've added your excess of black powder, then you can filter it off, give it a good stir, and then pour it through the filter paper.
So that it's nice and black. Okay, that's it, and then give it a stir, and then just pour it through. Okay, that's it. So show that.
So when you filter off your black powder, you end up with a nice clear blue solution. You can tip that blue solution into an evaporating basin and put the evaporating basin onto a tripod and put a Bunsen burner underneath it and start evaporating off the water from the blue solution. Now, what you want to do is you want to reduce the volume of the water by about half, and then allow the remainder of the water to evaporate. And if you do that, you'll get nice large blue crystals of copper sulphate. So these crystals here were formed from evaporating the blue solution and then allowing it to cool, and we get these nice large blue crystals. If you evaporate your solution to dryness, you tend to get very small crystals, and this is the copper sulphate that was evaporated to dryness. So if you want to form good crystals, reduce your solution to about half and then allow it to cool, and nice large crystals of copper sulphate will form. Now again, it's important that you understand the chemistry that is going on in this reaction. You reacted copper oxide, which is a base, with sulphuric acid, which is an acid. Now sulphuric acid makes sulfates and the metal is copper, so what you made was copper sulphate, and you make copper sulphate and water. Now in theory, all that you make in your reaction is copper sulphate and water, so if you added just the right amount of copper oxide to sulphuric acid, you would produce just copper sulphate and water. Well, it's always very difficult to add just the right amount of a solid to an acid to neutralise it. Now, fortunately, copper oxide is insoluble, so it forms a solid in solution. And because it's insoluble, it doesn't dissolve in water. The only copper oxide that will react with the sulphuric acid makes copper sulphate. Any extra copper oxide won't dissolve in the solution that's produced, and therefore you can filter off your excess copper oxide once all of your sulphuric acid has been neutralised. And therefore, because you've neutralised all of your acid, you've filtered off the excess copper oxide, all that you've got left in your solution is your copper sulphate and water, and therefore you can evaporate the water to get your copper sulphate crystals. So in terms of exam questions, there are two things that it could ask you about this core practical. They could either ask you about the chemistry, about the word and symbol equations, or they could ask you about the method, what you did and why you did it. And this question is a 6-mark question asking you about the method that you used. Now, it says copper sulphate is a soluble salt, and that's the important thing, it's soluble. And it says copper sulphate can be prepared by reacting copper oxide with dilute sulphuric acid. Copper oxide is insoluble. So describe how you would prepare some pure dry crystals of copper sulphate but by reacting excess copper oxide with dilute sulphuric acid. So take a known amount of sulphuric acid and warm it, add the copper oxide and stir until all of the acid has reacted and the copper oxide is in excess. Filter off the excess copper oxide and put the blue solution of copper sulphate into an evaporating basin. Reduce the volume to about half and allow to Cool. Get the crystals of copper sulphate, and the last thing that you're going to do, it says dry crystals, that's your crystals, and dry them in an oven to remove the water. I think that should get you the full 6 marks.